Hey guys, it's Sam with another RizomUV video with a few differences for this one. You'll notice that I'm not in my usual location, and that's because I'm abroad. But more importantly, for this video, we're partnering with our friends at Sierra Division, and they are offering their expertise and their tutors for a series of videos. This video is about UV preparation for asset baking. So without any further delay, I'll hand you to our tutor.
Hello everyone, my name is Robin Marianchi. I'm a senior 3D artist and an instructor on a texturing masterclass at Sierra Division. Today I'm going to show you how to create UVs so that your bakes come out nice and crisp. First I'm going to show you where to place your cuts, how to optimize your UV ions so that they can be packed efficiently, what can you do to reach your target texel density and improve detail on specific parts, and lastly how to do a final UV pack with a few stacked islands. First, we will start by creating UV cuts on our model. Whenever we have a model that has hard edges to control the shading, like for example here, we need to make sure that we create our UV cuts exactly in the same places. So in RizomUV, we can create our cuts specific for this part, and we know that all these edges are hard edges. So we need to cut these by double-clicking and pressing C. And then for cylinders, we also need to create a cut here, and then we can select the whole object, press U and O to optimize, and then we can press P for packing, and we can see this part being unwrapped right now. I also like to go to this top left corner and select either checkboard or grid to visualize which part I have already unwrapped. And now personally what I like to do is double click the object to select it all, zoom out a little bit, and move it out to keep this area clean for the next pieces. Now let's actually see what happens if we don't have cut in the places where we also have hard edges. So for this part I can press W to merge it, then U and O, and P to unwrap it all, to also merge this one, and now we have this cylinder unwrapped like this. You can see that the stretching is not too bad, but as you will see in the bakes, this will cause some issues. So let me bake this real quick and let me show you what the bake looks like. I've created a quick bake in Marmoset, and from the distance it might look okay, but if we zoom in closely we can see that there actually is this strange seam here, and this is caused exactly by the reason that we have a sharp edge here but we don't have a UV cut there. So let me actually introduce the cut back where it belongs and bake it quickly. And now back with Marmoset again, I created a new bake with the changed UVs, and as you can see now we got rid of the seam and it's looking much cleaner. And now let's continue with the cutting, and we can continue with this specific part here. Let's create the easy cuts first. So here we have a hard edge and we can double click this edge to select it. But if this is not working for you, then you need to make sure to go into the select panel and toggle the geometric checker. Now if we double click it, you can see that it is working. So we can press C to create the cut. Now let's do this for all the hard edges we have on this part. Then we will need to unwrap this big part like a cylinder. So let's create a cut here for the cap and also on the long line here. Let's also see for this top part here, I usually like to separate these parts like this, so we can hold Ctrl to use the continuous selection. Let's cut it. Now let's double click it all and see how it looks if we unwrap it real quick. It's not looking too bad, but we can see quite a bit of stretching. So let's investigate which part are these. So this part right here is being stretched quite a bit, so we need to do something about it. And actually instead of using this cut here in the back, we can introduce one in the front, and let's go from here around here like that, which will help relax this part a little bit. Let's also remove the one in the back. Let's unwrap it real quick, and we can see that the stretching is much better now. And I would say that these light reds and light blues are quite alright. You won't really notice this kind of stretching in your texture. And one thing to keep in mind as well is that this part, the red one, is actually covered by this trigger button here, so it won't even be seen. And the reason we can actually create a cut like this is that this model has some bevels here. if this was not made with bevels, but instead it had some hard transitions with sharp edges, we couldn't really cut it like this. And we would actually need to cut this whole part out, and we would have more islands. And a good rule for creating your UVs is to create the least amount of islands possible. And the reason for that is that every UV island needs some space around it. And so we can imagine in an example like this, we need some space between these islands. But now if we try to combine them all, we can see that they actually take up a little bit less space, and we can actually increase the whole UV island and get more resolution for it. And now let's get back to this part again. I can still see some stretching here. So for example, this part here is quite a bit red still. So let's cut it around like this. Let's unwrap it and optimize it like so. And the stretching is looking much better. You can also see that there is quite a bit of stretching around these holes here. So we can cut them like this, wrap them and optimize. And we can also cut them like a cylinder right here, for example, and unwrap them like so. Let's do this for all the holes. Sometimes it's better to cut some of the islands which are shaped strangely. For example, this one here looks a little bit weird, and it's better to have islands that look a little bit more uniform. So we could cut this one here, and let's optimize it and separate it like this. And I think this is looking actually a little bit better. And so there is this last part that still has quite a bit of stretching, and we can unwrap this like a regular cylinder right here. And let's see how it looks. Yeah, this is looking a little bit better. And actually I think that this part will be just fine because the stretching is not too strong here, and I think it will look okay. Only issue I might have it with right now is that it might cause some trouble with the packing, since it's not a very even part, but we will see about it when we get to that stage. And so this is another part that is finished, so I like to select it again and move it out of the space to sort of mark it as a finished part. Now let's unwrap this trigger part here together. If this was with hard edges, then we would need to create cuts along these edges here. But since this is not the case, we can actually create a lower number of cuts. So what we can do is we can try unwrapping it, and we can see there is quite a bit of stretching. And usually for parts such as these, we can just cut these corners here. Let's unwrap it, and you can see that the stretching is quite nice now, and we got away with it just by creating 4 cuts. Now this tape part here is easy, it's essentially just the side of a cylinder, and something like this should do it. Now for these little screws here, we don't actually need to create any cuts because these are pretty shallow, so if we unwrap them now, you can see that we don't get much stretching, and these are just fine. This part here is yet another cylinder, so we will cut off the caps. Let's also create one here. Let's unwrap it, and this will do just for now. This one here is easy, yet another cylinder. And this here is the last part that we need to cut and unwrap. So first we will need to mark the sharp edges, and there is an actually automatic way we can do that. That can be quite handy for parts that have a lot of sharp edges. So if we go into the edge mode, then go into the auto seams panel, let's select this angle button here. Let's keep it at default settings, and let's try clicking this little arrow here. As you can see, this selected just the hard edges, and you can just press C to create the cuts. If this little arrow doesn't select what you want, then you will need to play with the settings a little bit, and mostly just the angle limit will do. Then we just need to create the long cuts for the cylinders. Let's select all and unwrap, and as you can see, this is looking pretty good. And so we can wrap up this part. And there is also this one little part here that I forgot about. And this is the UV cuts finished. Now let's talk a little bit about texel density. This can be a little bit of a confusing topic, and we will have a more in-depth video talking specifically about this. But for now, let me briefly mention what it is for the purposes of creating UVs. So imagine that this square is 1K texture, 1024 by 1024. Now the way we can actually measure texel density is if we select an island and then go here into the texel density panel and click this eyedropper here. And what this is going to do is this is going to measure the texel density of the selected islands. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have multiple UV islands selected that have different texel density, is going to average it out, and it might not give you the best representation of the texel density. So you have to make sure that all the islands you are selecting are of the same or similar texel density. Now if I, for example, scale up this UV island and measure again, we get actually a higher texel density. If I scale it down, we get lower texel density. And what this means in simple terms is that the bigger the UV island is, the more pixels from the whole texture it can actually use. And the sharper the textures will appear on the object. And our overall goal is to get the highest amount of texel density possible for the current size of the texture. So all of the following techniques I'm going to be showing you will be used in order to maximize the highest amount of texel density we can get. So the first technique we are going to use is what I call the UV straightening. And what we want to do here is we want to make some of the islands as even as possible. For example, this UV island here, you can see that it has a slight curve here. And for this reason, it won't peg very efficiently, and this will actually create some empty spaces during the pegging algorithm. A much better shape for this part would be to look exactly like the one below or the one above. And for parts such as this one, which have very even quads, this is actually very easy, and we can go to the MISC transforms and search for the rectangularis polygons horizontally or vertically, and click one of them, and it's going to make the whole UV island nice and straight. So this way we could just move it around and actually decrease the amount of empty space around these. Usually the shapes that we can use rectangularis on are pretty easy to spot, and what we can do is we can actually select multiple of them and use the tool, and the straightening is done. But for example, this part here might look like the tool might work on it, but it's actually not going to work. And the reason for that is that this part here actually has some triangles here which break the algorithm for this tool, and it won't work. And this is where edge constraints come into play. So what we can do is we can select one of the edges. So let's select this one real quick. Then if we go to the Unwrap panel, click the down arrow, we can see some of these constraints. What I recommend is that you drag them out into the panel itself so we can have them quickly accessible, or even better, just buy them to shortcut. And now we already have the edge selected, and let's use the horizontal constraint. As you can see, this marks the edge with a blue color. Now if we select the whole island and hit O a bunch of times, you can see that it actually makes the edge straight and the whole shape a little bit more efficient for packing. We can also do it for the top part here, optimize it, and now it's nice and straight. But for this specific part, this actually introduces quite a bit of stretching. So let's take a closer look at the specific part. So what I think might help here is if we actually cut the top off like so and optimize it a little bit better, then we can actually straighten these. And I think that this is actually quite a bit better, and this will work. In some cases, you can also straighten these lines as well. So let's try doing it here. Let's use the vertical constraints in this case. Let's optimize it. And it actually doesn't introduce much stretching, so we can use it here. Let's try it here as well. And I think this works too. So let's keep it like this. Now let's straighten this island here. So I'll place cuts here, and a vertical one here. Let's optimize this, and this would actually be the perfect straightening. But what some people tend to do is they also tend to straighten this as well. But since there is quite a bit of difference in the straightness of this edge, this is going to introduce quite a bit of stretching. So for such parts as these, I recommend that you don't really straighten it here and just keep it like this. And actually, I think we can straighten this one because the curve was not too big, and I think that this works just fine. We can also preview the part in 3D space, and I think this is working quite well since we don't really see any obvious stretching here. This part here I think is quite a similar case, so let's try the same thing. And I think that's done for this part. But we can also try straightening these, and I think you'll see that the stretching is going to be pretty strong here. Yeah, I think this is a little bit too much, so let's go back. Now this part here looks a little bit more complex, but it's actually not too hard to straighten either. So let's tag the edges that look like they could be straight. Let's optimize real quick, and you might think that some of these might be tagged as well, so let's try it. And you can see that this here creates quite a bit of stretching, so we definitely need to not mark these. But for example, this one I think could be tagged, and yeah, this one is working quite nicely. But these right here do have a lot of curves to them, so I don't think they will really work. And I think that's it for this part. And of course, when you're going to be doing this for the first time, you might not be sure which edges can be straightened. So in these cases, you can do exactly what I did. You can try straightening them, and if they introduce too much stretching, just don't tag them, and next time you're gonna remember that. And now let's see how we can straighten this part here. So I think that this edge here is pretty obviously straight. We can especially see it in the 3D viewport, and so we have it tagged. And now as you can see, this is creating a little bit of stretching here, and perhaps this is a little bit too much. So what I would do for this part is I would just cut off the whole part here. Let's separate it, optimize this again, and this actually creates a little bit more relaxed result. And we can also straighten some of these parts here. And I think that we can actually keep this one as it is right now, because if we were to straighten it, it would need to stretch out these polygons, and it would be just too much stretching. So let's just do the side here, optimize a bunch of times, and let's call it done. Sometimes it might also make sense to make it for multiple islands at the time, so let's tag it real quick. Select them all together, optimize, and it's done. Let's also do the same thing for these 3 parts. And for this particular part, I think the stretching might be a little bit too much. So in this case, I think it might make sense to cut it off like so. I think that this is looking a little bit better. Sometimes you will also get UV islands that look like this one, which are essentially just a cylinder top that has a hole cut into it, and usually these are not the best for packing. And what you can do in these cases is you can actually introduce a cut here. I like to place it in the same place where these are, so let's place it here. Let's unwrap it and optimize. And actually it's not really optimizing right now, so what we can do, we can just go to the mist transform again and use rectangularize, and this part is done. And as you can see, this is much more efficient for packing. And now I think that this is it for the straightening. What I usually like to do is I like to select all the islands, hit P for packing, and then take a look at all the islands and see if all of them look nice and straight. And I think that in this case, everything looks nice and straight, except perhaps this one could get a little bit straighter here. Now let's talk about another very important part, and that is UV scaling. And what we can do to maximize the texel density is we can scale some of the islands down. To help us visualize this, let's go here at the bottom panel and let's change it from distortion to texel density. And now when we scale some of the islands, for example, let's scale this one, you can see that it goes into a red color. This means that it has lower texel density than the other parts around it. If it's a gray color, then it means it is basically art-based texel density. And this is something that changes depending on what texel density you have set here at the top. So if we measure this part here, this becomes now our base texel density, and these parts become blue, which means they are bigger than this part. So it's important to keep in mind that this texel density number should be your base texel density, so that any islands that are smaller than the base texel density or bigger than the texel density have a separate color. Now imagine that you scale some of the islands down. For example, if I scale this one now, you can see that this creates a lot of empty space that the other parts can fill in. So for example, what we can do is we can scale down some of these islands that won't really be seen. For some objects, like static objects in games, it would be a bottom part like this, but since this one is a blowtorch, it wouldn't really be static, and it is possible that this one would be seen. So we need to look for other islands. For example, this one here at the bottom will be very hardly seen. So this is an island we can actually scale down. And when it's an island that is pretty small, it might not make actually a big difference, but it's good to do it regardless. But it's good to keep in mind that it's always best to do it for some big islands that take up a lot of space. So what we can do for this scale down is not to actually scale it down manually, but we can go here into packing and scale panel. And here we have actually a number here that is currently set to 1. Now with the island selected, we can go to this number here and let's change it to something like 0.5. You can see that this tags the island with 0.5. And what this means is that when we actually pack the whole texture, so let's select it and press P, let's find the island, and we can see that this is actually 50% of the base scale. So if we measure the base scale, it's currently 2500-ish. And if we measure this one, it should be exactly half, which it is. And actually on this particular model, there are not that many islands that could be scaled down, but there are a few that could potentially be scaled. But they are usually pretty small, so they might not make a big difference. But let's scale them anyway. So for example, this one's here behind the screws will actually never be seen. So the best thing would be probably just to delete them, but let's say we want them to be there for whatever reason. So let's just scale them down. Let's do 0.25. And now we can see them being tagged. And for this part here, I'm actually thinking that we might utilize this trick as well. So since this part here is quite close to this one, it is likely that it won't really be seen much and it will be quite often in shadow. So I think we could try introducing a cut here. Let's try merging this one. Then we will need to fix the whole island again. Alright, so now that I've isolated this island here, I think we can scale it down. And since this is something that can somewhat be seen, I won't go as low as 0.25, but let's try going with 0.5. Let's try packing, let's find this part, and now it's quite a bit smaller, and I think this will work just fine. But of course, it might be best to always double check with your actual bakes and some texture testing to see if this part actually won't be a problem that it's going to be quite small. And I think that's it for the scaling down of these parts on this model. I don't think there is anything much else that would make sense to scale down, but actually there will be some parts that make sense to be scaled up. Now let's imagine that this is a game model and you have a restriction of only using a 1K texture. And now let's take a look at a quick bake. And what we can see is that some of these details are getting lost quite a bit. Some of the smoother parts look just fine, but we might perhaps want a little bit more detail on the detailed parts. So what we can do is we can just go to the parts that have a lot of those details. Let's select them. And now let's say that we want to make them 1.5 times bigger. Now let's repack real quick. Actually, let's also increase this part here as well. Let's do 1.3 for this one. And now let's get back to the bakes. And as you can see with the changes, these details are holding quite a bit better. Now let's talk about another very important part, and it's called UV stacking. So let's imagine you have multiple different parts that are essentially the same. This particular model doesn't have many of these parts that could be stacked, but we could actually use it for some of these screws. Actually, just these two. So what we can do is we can essentially just use one of those screws and have the other one copy the same UVs of the first one. For this, I like to isolate the parts I'm trying to stack. Then I like to select one of them. Then it's best to go to the similar settings. And when we are trying to stack two parts that are separate elements like this, we use across elements. If we are trying to stack two islands that are part of the same element, we will use across islands. Then there is the symmetry mode. The straight one will stack parts that are essentially not mirrored. They are basically just copied and dragged over. And then there is symmetry mode symmetric, which will stack parts that are actually mirrored and they are symmetric, or you can use both as well. In this case, these parts are straight, so we can use straight. What we can do now is select one of the islands, go to the similar up at the top. If we click on stack similar, it does nothing. So let's try changing the similarity, try lowering it a little bit, and now you can see that the bottom island disappeared, and now both of them are on top of each other. Now the important part when doing this is to keep in mind that for your bakes you should not keep these islands on top of each other. The reason for that is that when you're gonna be baking your texture, the baker actually won't know which one of these it should use for the baking. So it's sort of going to use both of them, and it might create some baking errors for you. So let's actually try doing it right now. Okay, so in this case we were actually lucky and it actually worked, but it is not going to be always the case. So let me actually show you an example where this breaks. And so in this particular example, we have a little bit of a more complex model. And all these parts on the right are actually parts that have been stacked, and they are correctly offset to the right to prevent any sort of baking issues. Now let's try moving them to the left and see what it breaks. We can move them easily by one UV set if we hold shift and press the left arrow, and it's done. We have this nice and clean bake here. So let's now try baking it with the stacked UV islands in the same UV space. And now the bakes have finished with the stacked textures, and if we look at some of the parts that have been stacked, for example this part here, you can see that it created some strange artifacts here. And here as well you can see some strange triangle, and it will be same on the other side because it's essentially the same part. So this is a great reason why you should be offsetting your stacked UV islands and keeping only one of them in the active UV space. And now let's get back to the torch. For this particular model I wouldn't really create many stacked islands, but let's say we are trying to maximize the texel density and we are really tight on budget, and in such cases we can actually introduce some mirrored parts. So for example, what we can do is we could cut in half this cylinder here, and now these two parts will be essentially symmetrically identical. We just need to make sure that they actually are identical, and let's move this cut here, and now they are actually equal. And in my workflow I really like to do the stacking as the last part after the packing. So what I usually do before the packing is I sort of look for the parts that could be stacked, and so we have this one here. I like to just move them to the side to an area that I will remember should be for the stacked parts. So we can do the same for one of the screws. Let's move it here, and let's actually change the UVs on this part a little bit. So I'm going to remove all the cuts, and we can actually cut it like so. Let's unwrap it real quick, and what we can do now is we can essentially mirror or stack one of these parts since they are identical. So let's move one of them to the side. I usually try to be consistent with which side is actually mirrored. So for this part, it's this side. So let's also do it this side here to the side. Let's move this one to the back. And let's say this is it for the stacked parts. Now let's talk about what settings to use for packing. So let's say our target texel density is somewhere around 6000, and this target is usually set by the project you are working on. For example, in a game, you will just usually be given a number that you are trying to reach. So if we measure a texel density of a quick pack on a 1K texture on an island that we know is the base texel density, it doesn't have the number that is higher or lower, and if we measure it, currently we get something around 2,700, and this is nowhere near the goal of 6,000. And the 6,000 in this case, by the way, is just an arbitrary number. It does not really reflect real texel density you might want in a game. And so to reach this goal, what we need to do is we'll need a bigger texture than 1K, since even if we pack this a little bit better, I don't think we will be able to get near 6,000. So let's try increasing the texture to 2K. And now we can measure the island again. And now we can see that it's 5,500. And this is much closer to our goal. So this means that if we pack all these islands more efficiently, we use all the empty space, we will actually be able to reach our goal. And so now that we have determined that the 2K texture will be good enough to reach our goal, we need to change some other settings as well. And so the first setting to look at is in the packing panel right here at the top. So the first one is margin and the second one is padding. So if you don't know what these terms mean, if we zoom in closer to the islands, padding means essentially the space in pixels between separate islands. So the minimum space for each of these islands would be, in this case, 8 pixels. And the reason to have these spaces between the islands is that when you actually use the model in an engine, for example, if the spaces are too small, some of the textures from the second island might start bleeding into one another and it might cause some visual issues. To give you sort of a general rule, I would say that for a 2K texture, 8 pixel padding would be pretty much the minimum you would want to use. So you could use either 8 or 16. Then for a 4K texture, you could use 16 or 32, which is exactly double of what the 2K is. And if you go down, then it's half that again. So for a 1K texture, it would be in range of 4 to 8, and for 512, it would be half that. But it is not a strict rule. For example, for a 4K texture, you might also use 8 pixels in some cases if the project you are working on allows it and it doesn't cause any visual issues. And of course, the smaller number you use for the padding, the more pixels the island themselves get and the higher your texel density will be. Now you might wonder what margin exactly is and why is it 4 pixels, and margin usually is exactly half of your padding. And the reason for that is that margin is essentially this space between the borders of the texture. And why is it exactly half? Is because you have this padding on both sides. So here you will have 4 pixels and you will also have 4 pixels here. And now when you imagine that the UV is actually tiling infinitely, if I move this island exactly to the next UV space, you can see that there is now equal amount of space. So 4 and 4, which is in total 8 pixels of space. And now let's talk about the other settings you also need to change. So the next one in line is going to be the packing strategy in the packing panel. So the efficient one you should only use for quick packing when you're just testing stuff. It's not very precise. To get good precision, you will need to use the padding perfect one. But of course, this one will be much slower, but it's going to give you the best results. Next setting is the scale setting. So the base scale I usually use just equalize, and what this does, it sets all the texel density for these islands to be equal. Of course, the ones with number will be a little bit bigger or smaller. The best scale finder we can also keep at the default setting and keep it at autofit. And now the base orientation, we can keep it at automatic, but in some cases it can rotate your islands a little bit unusually. So for example, this one here is rotated a little bit and I would like it to be a little bit more straight. So I will straighten this, and if I pick it now with this orientation automatic, it's going to rotate it. You can see it's rotated now. So let's go back. If I set it to keep current, it's actually not going to change the base rotation of the island. So if I hit back now, it actually keeps it consistent. But it's also good to keep the best orientation finder at 90 degrees. And what this means that if the packing algorithm thinks that it will be better to rotate this island like this, it can do that. But it won't use any value that is lower than 90 degrees. so we can be sure that the island won't end up like this and it will be nice and straight. Then for the accuracy, I like to keep it at maximal to get the best precision possible. And then the mutations. I like to max it out because it doesn't take a long time for my computer, but depending on your hardware, you might want to adjust this value. But the more mutations you have, the more likely it is going to be that you get the best result. Now also this use GPU setting might be important for you. You will need to try this out on your specific hardware and see if the GPU is faster for you, or if you check it out, it's going to use the CPU, and that might be faster for you. I also noticed that they can give slightly different results, and in some cases some of them can actually give a better result than the other one, since the packing algorithms are slightly different. So if you're really struggling to get a nice pack, it might be worth changing it out here. And so that's actually it for the settings. And so what we can do is we can actually hit the P button to start packing. One thing to keep in mind is that since we have these islands here, we actually don't want to pack them in. So we can either select all these islands and hit P, and it will pack just the selection, or we can just isolate these islands and then hit P without the selection, and it's just going to pack these islands. So let's do that and see the result. And now I'm back after waiting a minute or so, and this is my result. And I think this is pretty nice. And actually I did try packing with the CPU and the GPU in this case, and in this case the CPU gave me a slightly better result, so I went with that. Now if I measure the texel density, we can see that we are at 6455, which means we have reached our goal and even exceeded it. And so now what is left to do is we need to remember that we still have these islands that we need to stack. So let's zoom out a little bit and let's select these islands. So what I like to do is I like to select the two islands that I'm trying to stack. Then I go into isolation mode, then I go to the similar settings, and since these two islands are part of the same element, what we can do is we can change it to across islands, since across elements doesn't apply here, and we can choose symmetric since we want to stack it symmetrically. And then let's try selecting this island here, the original one, and let's try hitting the stack similar button. And it worked, at least almost. It's not giving me exactly the result I'm looking for. The result I'm looking for is that this texture should essentially be mirrored in this part here. So it didn't exactly mirror it symmetrically. So we could try perhaps changing it to straight if it does anything differently. And it does it differently, but it doesn't do exactly what we need. So what we can do is we can actually select this island and flip it manually in this Mask Transform section here. And now we can see that we get the desired mirror result. And it means that the parts are now stacked correctly. And now what we have to do is we have to select the part that we want to offset and hit Shift and the right arrow, and it's going to move it to the next UV space so we don't get any of the baking issues I was showing you before. Now let's do the same thing for this part here. So this is the one we want to mirror, and we want to mirror it or stack it to this one. And so select the symmetric mode, keep it at across islands, and let's try stacking it. It doesn't work, and the reason for that is actually that this island is slightly different and it has this extra edge here that shouldn't really be here, and for this reason the stacking tool does not like it. So we will need to change this in the modeling software, and this is something to keep in mind, that sometimes when the stacking tool doesn't really work is that it's likely that one of the parts is a little bit different in terms of topology, and we need to actually change it to match the other part. And so I'm back after changing it in my modeling software, and let's see if it works now. So the settings are as we want them to be. Let's try stacking it. As you can see, it worked perfectly. And in this case, the orientation is also correct. So we can just offset it with the Shift and right arrow. And that's it, only one part remains. So let's select it, let's select the other one, let's stack it, offset it, and that's it. That's all our stacked parts, and we are done with the packing. We have successfully reached our target texel density goal, and the UVs are ready for nice and clean bakes. And so that's it all from me. Thank you so much for watching. Hope that you learned something new and are ready to take your UVs head on.
If you enjoyed our video, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for video updates. You can check us out on social media, Discord and our website, links in the description. And if you're looking for more RizomUV content, you can choose one of these videos on screen. That's it. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.